very much, Padmavajra. Yet another very generous introduction, and very good morning to my brothers my friends in the Padmaloka community, sitting in this wonderful space surrounded by Buddhas and Bodhisattvas and goddesses and gods and angels. We really are in a wonderful environment here, and a very good morning to all of you who are watching this, listening to this, wherever you are. I was having a look at the screen, seeing you all, coming in from different parts of the cosmos, and or at least certainly different parts of Europe and different parts of Britain. And it's a bit Mahayana Sutra-like, isn't it? Where you get all these different beings kind of coming in, from one world system or another to gather with the Sangha. In that case, to listen to the Buddha. You're not listening to the Buddha today, you're listening to me. And I'm going to start with a quotation. Even though I was born in the Hindu religion, I will not die in the Hindu religion. This oath I made years ago. Yesterday I proved it true. I am happy. I am ecstatic. I am liberated from hell. This is how I feel. But I do not want any blind followers. Those who come into the Buddhist religion should come with understanding. They should consciously accept that religion. I do not like sheep mentality. Those who go for refuge to the Buddha must do so after counting the cost, because it is a religion very difficult to practice. So these incredibly strong words are, of course, the words of Dr. B R Ambedkar, B R Ambedkar, Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar. And he said these words in a great speech he gave in Marathi. This is a poor English translation. A great speech he made after the day after the great mass conversion, where hundreds of thousands of his followers, his Dalit followers, regarded traditionally as untouchables according to the caste system, hundreds of thousands had converted at his hands after he converted himself. I'm starting here because on the 14th of October, just a few days' time, it's the 64th anniversary of Dr. Ambedkar's great mass conversion. Bhante Sangharakshita has said that Dr. Ambedkar, in the short time he was a Buddhist, because he died, I think, only 6 or 8 weeks after the great conversion, Dr. Ambedkar had done more for Buddhism in India since the Emperor Ashoka, which is an extraordinary thing to say, and Bhante doesn't say things lightly, an extraordinary thing to say. And I've started with this because of that phrase of Dr. Ambedkar's, I feel ecstatic, I am happy, I am liberated from hell. I am liberated from hell. A big attraction to the Dhamma for Dr. Ambedkar and his followers is liberation. Liberation from caste identity, liberation from being designated as lower than the lowest. Liberation is one of the great motivations for contemporary Buddhists in India. And of course, it is very much associated with social liberation. It's to do with being liberated from an oppressive system. But Dr. Ambedkar's conversion to Buddhism, what he saw in Buddhism, it has to be the liberation of the mind. Yes, there does need to be political, social liberation. There needs to be a complete change in society. But Dr. Ambedkar's conversion to Buddhism was because he recognized that there needed to be a change of consciousness. There needed to be a complete change of consciousness, not just among so-called Dalits, the downtrodden, but throughout the whole of Indian society. Yes, you can legislate change. Dr. Ambedkar was the first law minister in the government of India, though he had, the lowliest of origins and background. He was himself a Mahar, an outcast community of Maharashtra. Though he started in that way, he reached those heights within Indian society and politics. And of course, he outlawed untouchability. That's a tremendous achievement in democratic India. And it's still there on the statute books. But he said, you can change the laws. You can have all sorts of what we might call affirmative action, positive discrimination and so on. But that doesn't necessarily change the culture. It doesn't change people's minds. It doesn't change people's attitudes. You have to understand, very hard for us in the West to understand, that the notion of caste is religiously sanctioned. The graded system of inequality, as Dr. Ambedkar described it, is religiously sanctioned. It goes deep down into the culture. I mean, we know all about discrimination in the West. We've become made much more aware in recent times of racial discrimination and how terrible that is. Any kind of discrimination, how terrible that is. But in India, we're talking about a deeply embedded religious outlook, cultural outlook. So there needs to be a change of consciousness, a change at the deepest possible level. There needs to be what Sangharakshita calls a Dhamma revolution, Dhamma Kranti. Not just one conversion moment, but a revolution in terms of the Dhamma, a totally peaceful, non-violent revolution, but that level of change and transformation, moving in the direction of complete freedom within the whole of society. And I met people who were around at the time of the first great conversion, and I said, well, how did you feel? And they always said they felt free, they felt liberated. Just taking this step of going for refuge to the Buddha, Dharma and the Sangha was a huge change in itself, even though their life became in some ways more difficult after the conversion. There was that complete change of heart and mind. So this is, I think, very important when we have a weekend devoted to the taste of freedom, the taste of liberation, the vimutti rasa, as it's called in traditional Pali. We need to also understand that this sense of liberation, this vision of liberation that the Buddha communicated in his day, has inspired a whole movement of not just individual, as it were, spiritual change, but has inspired a whole movement of social change, that the Dhamma has something to say, it does have something to offer in terms of a complete change in society. Dr. Ambedkar, in some of his thinking about Buddhism, insisted that for there to be a religion, a new religion, if you like, that people follow, it needs to have at its centre a vision of a different society. And he said that what the Buddha taught was liberty, equality, fraternity. He said he didn't learn these slogans from the French Revolution. He learned them from his master, the Buddha. And he has a very, very interesting insight into liberty, equality, fraternity. He talks about these particularly in a famous ungiven lecture, which was published as a book called Annihilation of Caste. And he talks about fraternity. He looks at these different things in reverse order, but he talks about fraternity in a very interesting way. Fraternity meaning that there should be complete freedom of movement between all sections of society. There should be no discrimination in terms of human contact and human communication. In fact, he says fraternity is another word for democracy, but by not democracy, he didn't just mean one person, one vote. He meant having an attitude of reverence and respect for all your fellow men. Dr. Ambedkar's insights here into the nature of fraternity, into the nature of democracy, we really badly need them now. Reverence and respect for all men. This, later on, he saw as being the essence of the Dhamma. Reverence and respect for every person that you meet. He said it's the most holy thing, and it's for all situations and all circumstances. When he talks about liberty, he said it's not just freedom to live, freedom of life and limb, freedom from oppression. It's the freedom to be able to use all of your powers. You know, a proper society, a just society, a truly human society. There shouldn't just be this fraternity, this brotherhood, this democracy. It must enable every individual to engage all of their powers. So again, there's this emphasis on the development of the individual, the development of the human being. This is a big, big feature of his conversion speech, that what we badly need in life is inspiration, utsaha, to use the Marathi word, that the old systems that come from, caste injustice do not enable you to have any inspiration, because you've got no chance of employing all your powers. So we need to create environments in which you can be inspired. Equality, he says, is more problematic, he says, because actually all men aren't equal. But for all practical purposes, you need to treat everybody as equal, in the sense of having equal access and opportunity to develop themselves. But he said, people are different. They have different qualities. But for practical reasons, you need to treat them equally. So it's very understandable that Dr. Ambedkar should be attracted to the Buddha and the Buddha's teaching, because the Buddha's teaching was for everybody. The Buddha made no distinction in terms of men, women, their particular caste, background, high, low, whatever their walk of life, they were moving in. His Dhamma was for everybody. It was for the Bahujan, the Bahujana, the many people. This is an anti-caste term. There's no discrimination whatsoever. The Buddha said, I am not a bad teacher with a tight fist who holds things back. My Dhamma is for everybody. It's for the Bahujan. And he urged his early disciples to go forth for the welfare and the happiness of the Bahujan, of the many people. We need to reach the many people. Because of my experience in India over those years, which actually comparatively wasn't that long, I must say my faith and confidence in the Dhamma has grew considerably, because Dr. Ambedkar was an intensely practical man who could work with great expertise in so many areas: politics, economics, education, trades unionism, law, all these different fields. He was a great rationalist as well, even though he had a strong devotional side, an inner side, if you like. But the fact that he should see that the Buddha's vision of human beings is the most liberating vision that there is, and the most liberated vision. The fact that he could see that, a man like that could see that, increased my confidence in what the Dhamma could do. If enough of us practice it, and seeing my friends in India practicing it and living it in very, very difficult conditions, but if enough of us come together and base ourselves on the teachings of the Buddha, the example of the Buddha, the example of Dr. Ambedkar, if enough of us do this, we can have an incredible effect on the world around us. Because, as I say, it is the most liberating vision that there is for human beings. Because the Buddha himself places no limit on development. In Buddhism, as you all know, I'm sure, Buddhism is profoundly non-theistic. It's profoundly non-theistic. That means there is no ceiling on existence. There is no ceiling placed upon ourselves. There's no notion of anything fixed and unchanging according to the Buddha's vision. So there's no limitation placed on creative unfolding. There's no limitation placed on what a human being is. So there's no limitation on the ways in which we can connect with one another. The Dhamma of the Buddha does indeed offer the way to freedom and liberation for ourselves individually and for ourselves and one another collectively. So it's good, it's really important that we've got a weekend devoted to the taste of freedom, the taste of liberation. It's good that we reflect on the taste of freedom. And, I hope in the course of this weekend we can really go into this in some depth. We're limited in terms of time about how far we can go into this. But let's see what we can do. This metaphor, this image, this phrase, the taste of freedom, comes from a very famous teaching of the Buddha. It comes from a very famous teaching of the Buddha given in the Udana. Padmavajra mentioned this teaching last night, and many years ago, I think in the late 70s, early 80s, Sangharakshita gave a famous lecture called The Taste of Freedom, devoted to this particular story from the Udana. And I remember I was present at that lecture, and it's a magisterial lecture. If you want to have a sort of sense of how to read a Pali text, how to really study a Pali text, and how to draw out the meaning of a Pali text, you couldn't do no better than studying Sangharakshita's lecture, The Taste of Freedom. Really what we should be doing is just putting up that video of his so that you can all watch that and talk about that. That would be much better. But anyway, here I am doing my thing. And as Padmaloka said, in this particular story, the Buddha gives a teaching prompted by a particular incident, which we won't go into here. The Buddha gives a great teaching, where first of all he talks about the great qualities of the great and mighty ocean. And this must have been quite an event, because probably none of the people present, including the Buddha himself, had ever seen the great and mighty ocean. He's talking about this legendary body of water, which is even greater than the river Ganges, which is somewhere west of them and somewhere east of them, but this vast stretch of water with incredible depths and mysteries and full of all sorts of strange and wonderful creatures and all sorts of jewels, and there are all sorts of stories, travellers' tales about this incredible body of water. So you can imagine the monks, it's late at night when the Buddha is talking, or early morning, something like that. They've been together for a long time. The Buddha just starts talking about the ocean, as if he's telling a story. And then he likens the Dhamma, or the Dhamma Vinaya, so that's the truth and its application, the principle and the practice in life. He talks about the Dhamma Vinaya as having the same qualities as the great and mighty ocean. And one of the things that Bhante draws out in his lecture is that, of course, as soon as you start talking about the Dhamma as the great and mighty ocean, you're really evoking its mystery, its profundity, its depth, its sort of foreignness in the sort of transcendental sense. It's something I think very important for us to remember. We read a bit of Buddhism. Maybe some of us have been reading a bit of Buddhism for 40 years or more, in my case, and you can start assuming that you're a sort of Dharma expert. Well, forget it. Forget that way of thinking about yourself. You always need to be going deeper into the Dharma, and the more deeper you go into the Dharma, you realise that it's deeper still. There's no end to the discoveries of the Dharma. This is one of the problems that we have with the language of attainment. that you've arrived somewhere at some special stage that you can sort of congratulate yourself on. Well, the image of the Dharma as the great and mighty ocean gives the lie to that. You go on deeper and deeper and deeper. Thank goodness. How boring it would be if you come to some sort of end point. There is always deeper to go into the great Dhamma. And one of the images he gives for the Dhamma, among the many images, is to do with the rivers that flow into the great and mighty ocean. That when the Ganges and the Saraswati and the Yamuna and so on, when they flow into the great and mighty ocean, they lose their names. They're no longer the Ganges and the Saraswati. They're just known as the great and mighty ocean. So in the same way, when people enter my Sangha, says the Buddha, they lose their caste names. They are no longer identified as Brahmin, as warrior, as outcast, as merchant, or whatever you want to call it. That goes. And they are just now sons or daughters of the Buddha, of the Sakya. I think this is really, really important, that we lose our identity when we live a Dhamma life, especially when we commit ourselves to the Dhamma life. Our identity that we formed before this point has to be renounced completely. And we are meeting from then on as sons, as daughters of the Buddha. We are just in this Dhamma ocean together. We are in this liberated place. I think this is tremendously important, perhaps particularly relevant at this time. I think, again, the Buddha has a unique vision into the whole nature of identity. If you like, our identity needs to be identity-less. That's our identity. I remember once Bhante saying that the status of order members is a non-status. As Dharmacharis and Dharmacharinis, we have a non-status, very perfection of wisdom, because we've left behind all those limiting ideas of what a human being is. We've entered into the life of the Dhamma, this completely liberated vision. You can see how attractive this is to Buddhists in India, to people seeking to leave an oppressive identity. But he also has another metaphor. He says, just as the great ocean has the taste of salt, wherever you go in the ocean, it tastes of salt. You know it's the ocean because of its salty taste. In the same way, my Dhamma, the Dhamma Vinaya, has the taste of liberation, the Vimutti Rasa, the taste of liberation. You know it's the Dhamma. You know it's the Buddha's teaching. If it has this flavour, this direct flavour, not an idea, this is very important, not a concept, but the taste of liberation. You feel its liberating power. Dr. Ambedkar says, I feel ecstatic. I feel liberated from hell. I am liberated from hell. It's not that is a direct experience for him. He has the direct taste of liberation in becoming a Buddhist. So this is really very, very important when we take up Buddhist practice, that we are looking, if you like, can you look for a taste? I don't think you can. But we're sensing the taste. We're tasting the taste of liberation, of freedom. If that's not happening, then either the teaching isn't really the Dhamma, or our application of the Dhamma is not as it should be. I think this is really important. It could be as well, that the Dhamma makes us aware, more keenly aware, of how unfree we are, how unliberated we are. Maybe we have to wake up at first to how unfree we are before the taste of freedom can actually be tasted. It's very interesting, isn't it, that The Buddha, before he left home, before he was a Buddha, he describes his experience of home life. Not just home life in the sense of the extended family and all the responsibilities that went with that, but the whole attitude, the whole habitual attitude that he was subjected to, not just on him, but presumably within him. Very interesting phrase in one of the oldest of the Pali texts, in the Going Forth from the Sutta Nipata. He says, "Cramped is this life at home, dusty indeed its sphere. Open the going forth. Open the going forth. When you go forth, you live out in the open, under the sky, in the open air." Of course, he means that literally, but we can also take it as a metaphor. When we take up our Buddhist practice, we might notice how cramped we are, but through practice we can see an opening. We can see things opening up more and more for us. It might even be in our Buddhist practice that after a while we feel that cramping again. Well, it might be that you've got to practice more deeply. You've got to look for another opening within your Dharma practice itself. So I think thinking in terms of freedom and liberation, looking for the experience of liberation, is tremendously important. There is, in fact, a path that the Buddha lays out called the 8 Vimuttis, the 8 liberations. It's saying that the whole of the path can be seen in terms of greater and greater liberation, all the way to enlightenment itself, to nirvana itself, that being the ultimate liberation, a completely inconceivable liberation, a liberation beyond all language, beyond all words. But we're seeing a kind of progression of liberation in our Dhamma life. The ultimate end of the path, yes, the Buddha describes as vimutti. I remember years ago, some of us, the Mitra conveners, the then Mitra conveners, were studying Bhante's lecture, The Taste of Freedom, with him. In those days, Bhante had his sight had become very poor. He couldn't really see, so he couldn't read the text. We were having to read the text to him, and then we'd talk. And we started to talk about vimutti, vimukti in Sanskrit. We started to explore that, and Bhante said, "Well, you do have to understand that the way we're discussing freedom is in terms of vimukti, and vimukti is synonymous with enlightenment. Liberation here is like no liberation that we've experienced. We're talking about it as ultimate liberation, unbounded consciousness, if you like." And of course that's just words. And of course we wanted to dive in and ask all sorts of questions of him, and he just very quietly just said, perhaps what we need to do is to sit and contemplate that vimukti means nirvana. Something like that. And he just sat and contemplated, sitting in his chair. And we went into silence, and I had the sense that Bhante was being quite literal. In that moment, he was contemplating vimukti in the deepest and most profound sense. I didn't quite know what to do with myself. I felt a bit sort of stupid, and didn't know what to do with my mind, but I could watch him sinking more deeply into the contemplation of vimukti. So, what are we to make of this? What do we make of this sense of liberation? How do we practice the path of liberation? And as Padmavajra said, we can find a path of liberation. I think it's very important that we explore the practicalities of the path of liberation, rather than me just getting very rhetorical about liberation. We need to have a good look at what we can do, what's the traditional way of practicing to live a life of liberation, to follow the path of liberation. And as Padmavajra said, this is found in the Meghiya Sutta, another sutta from the Udana. Interestingly enough, I don't know if any of you have seen the latest video from Ergin House. Vidya Devi was telling us about the fact that one of the seminars she's working on for the complete works is on the Udana, which is a key Pali collection for us. And I've seen early versions of her seminar. It's fantastic material. Honestly, you really are in for a treat in that next, I don't know if it's the next one exactly, but in that forthcoming collected works. I mean, again, you've got a real insight into the way to read a Pali collection and to make it live for you. And at the same time, they're also doing another volume on Buddhist revival in India. So you're going to get more of Bhante on Dr. Ambedkar and the living of the Dhamma life in terms of that community. Fabulous material is going to be emerging from that tremendous project. So the Meghiya Sutta tells the story of a monk who's an attendant of the Buddha. And he goes on his alms round and leaves the Buddha to go and beg his food. And on his way back from after collecting his food, he finds a wonderful mango groves. Mango groves, especially in the hot season in India, are wonderful places. They're so cool, so lovely to sit in the shade with their dense green leaves. And he has his food, and Meghiya thinks, wow. Oh, I don't think they said wow in the Parliament, but anyway, he thinks, oh, this would be a great place to meditate. This is a great place for solitary retreat. If the Lord, if the Bhagwan, if Bhante gives me permission, I will come back here and I'll strive for enlightenment. So he goes back to the Buddha and he tells him about the mango grove. He tells him that he wants to strive, and the Buddha's reply is a little bit cool. He says, well, just wait, Meghiya, just wait until another monk comes to look after me. And Meghiya says, no, I really want to go and strive, Bhante. I really want to do that. And the Buddha says, no, just wait a little bit. Wait for somebody else to come to look after me. And he says, but look, Bhagwan, Bhante, you've done everything that needs to be done. You've gained enlightenment. I haven't done what needs to be done. I haven't gained enlightenment. Let me go to that grove. And the Buddha says, yes, Meghiya, do what you think it the time for. Here I think it's very interesting, instructive from the point of view of freedom. The Buddha genuinely wants Meghiya to stay. He thinks it would be better for him and for the Buddha himself if he stayed to care for him. But Meghiya is very, very eager, so he doesn't order him to stay. He says, no, do what you think at the time for. He treats Meghiya as an individual, even though he has obviously doubts to the efficacy of Meghiya's actions. I think this is really, really important little insight into the nature of spiritual friendship and spiritual community. There must be no forcing and compulsion. You can inspire, you can urge, you can even, make a strong recommendation, but it's very, very important that within the spiritual community, within life itself, that people are always encouraged to act from their individuality. I think this is tremendously important. So off he goes. Off he goes to the mango grove. He sits down under a tree and starts, getting ready to meditate. Can't meditate. He is absolutely overwhelmed with sex fantasies and violent fantasies. Sex and violence just fills his mind. Absolutely overwhelmed, and he's really working to rid himself. He's just not free. His mind is not free. Again, this is an interesting insight into freedom. We can go to the best place where we're free, the mango grove. We've all got our versions of the mango grove where we go, yes, if I have these conditions, I'll meditate, I'll enter dhyana, I'll write that poem, I'll paint that painting, I'll make that music, I'll be happy. But you get away from this person, this situation, and I will just expand my consciousness. But you've taken your mind with you. And if your mind isn't trained, what's it going to be overwhelmed with? It's going to be overwhelmed with, well, if not sex and violence, maybe a lot of trivia, a lot of rubbish. I noticed this on solitary retreats. I mean, sometimes there's intense, nasties going on in my mind, but a lot of the time it's the utter banality of consciousness, the utter triviality of mind, the really, really kind of pathetic, commercial radio station of the mind is playing itself out all the time. So we're not free. It makes it clear that we've got to work on our consciousness. We've got to liberate our minds. And Megha goes back to the Buddha and he explains. And Megha is wonderfully naive. I think he's quite young. He's amazed at what's happened. He keeps thinking, well, I went forth out of faith. I went forth into the homeless life. I have complete faith in what the Buddha teaches. Why is this happening to me? He's just sort of shocked that this could be happening to him. And he goes to the Buddha and explains. And the Buddha doesn't rebuke him. He doesn't go, oh, I told you so. The Buddha has no egotism in that way. The Buddha's compassion is totally forgiving. It's totally wise and understanding. It doesn't have any kind of interest in punishment or anything of that nature. The Buddha's compassion is only concerned with the growth and the maturing of us as individuals. So what does he say? He just says, Megha, when the liberation of the heart is immature, 5 conditions leads to its maturing. Beautiful, beautiful phrase. The liberation of the heart is the translation of Cheto Vimutti. Cheto meaning mind, heart, consciousness, us. That's what the Buddha is talking about, who we are in our deepest sense, the whole of us. That's what Cheto means here. Vimutti is liberation, freedom, release. The release, the liberation, the freedom of the heart. When it's immature, the word for immature is really interesting. It's aparipakaya. You might be interested to know that the word paripakaya, which means maturing, can also means ripening. It also means cooked. It's actually related to the modern Indian word paka, which literally means cooked or soft or ripe. So when our heart, the liberation of our heart is unripe, uncooked, undeveloped, when it's immature, these are the things we need to do to bring it to its maturity. There's a lovely word in the opposite of paka in modern Indian languages is kacha, meaning uncooked, hard. You often say this. We might say this about somebody in their Dhamma life, and how they're getting on. They're a bit kacha. We could do with a bit more cooking, a bit more maturing. Well, we could all do with that. We're all a bit kacha in that sense. So I'm going to go through these five dhammas, these 5 teachings, these 5 conditions, and see in what way each of them leads to the liberation of the heart. So the first thing that the Buddha talks about, he says the first thing is that you need to have kalyana mitras. You need to have spiritual friends. You need friends in the Dhamma life. You need friends who are encouraging you to liberate your heart. And he says, his language is very strong, you need strong bonds of spiritual friendship and intimate spiritual friends. It's not just bonds of friendship, but there's an intimacy, a closeness, a close connection with spiritual friends. You've got easy access to them. You're meeting them regularly. In other words, you're meeting people who are just concerned with the maturing of your heart's liberation. You need to also, of course, be giving that yourself, making sure that in your communication with people, you are encouraging them in their heart's liberation. I think it's very interesting, isn't it, that the notion of liberation and freedom, the first place that the Buddha talks about is relationships with others. Sometimes when we want to be free, we feel we want to be free, it's a bit reactive. I just want to get away from people. It's people, it's other people that are stopping me, from being free. Well, maybe there are some people who are stopping you. The kind of relationships and communication you have. Maybe there's a co-created sense of imprisonment that's going on in your communication. But you also need to develop a communication which is encouraging freedom. It's not just freedom from, it's freedom to. And of course, metta, loving kindness and compassion, and sympathetic joy, equanimity, the Brahma-viharas, are themselves also described as the liberation of the heart. So it's really, really important that there's this connection made between metta, between love, and liberation. And you've probably noticed when you really get into the metta bhavana, in freeing yourself from the restrictions of hatred and indifference, you enter into a great freedom because there's no block, to your loving kindness. There's no block to where you can go, as it were, in your consciousness, because the field of living beings is a field of freedom, because it's a field of loving behaviour, loving kindness. But it's important to have particular people who we know, who we can rely on for encouraging the liberation of the heart, just through being with them. Yes, there's all sorts of things that go on in spiritual friendship. You can talk about the challenges that you're facing. You can talk about your inspiration freely. You can talk about the Dhamma with them. Your friends might, on occasion, give you a bit of critical feedback, as we call it, to help you work on particular areas that might be blind spots for you. They might be sort of indicating completely new perspectives on life. All that goes on, but sometimes it's just all that matters is that you're together. You're just together in friendship. You have this lovely notion in Indian religious tradition of darshan, of being with and seeing spiritual friends. That's enough sometimes. And sometimes, very often in the life of the Buddha, people just saw the Buddha. They were just happy to sit with the Buddha all night long sometimes and enter into a great silence. This is being seen and the seeing of spiritual friends. So coming together in friendship, you can feel that sense of the liberation of the heart. The heart is opening up. You are opening up. You feel that new possibilities are opening up. This morning I wrote an email to my dear friend Bodhisattva in India, and just thanking him for his kindness when I was first around the movement, and how many different things he opened up to me, including going to India. I wouldn't have gone to India without Lokamitra's friendship. And it's very important, I think, to remember, the friends in our life who've brought us to a greater freedom, introduced us to openings into the richness of life. We really need our friends, and in turn to be a friend like that to others. So this is the first condition that leads to the liberation of the heart. In fact, the Buddha says that this is the main condition, because all the other conditions he mentions come from spiritual friendship. This is like his teaching that Kalyana Mitrata is the whole of the Dhamma life, not the half of it. everything comes out of it, because everything comes from people. Everything comes from friends. So the next thing he talks about, that if you want to bring about the maturing of the liberation of the heart, you need to live a committed life. The word is samvara, committed especially to your code of ethics. In our case, it will be the 5 or the 10 precepts. You're really committed to training in the ethics, in the natural ethics that the Buddha teaches: abstention from harming living beings and loving kindness, abstention from stealing, taking the not given, and open-handed generosity, abstention from sexual misconduct in all its forms, and the practice of stillness, simplicity and contentment, abstention from false speech and living truthfully, speaking the truth, communicating the truth, but also, and this is implied, in communicating the truth with kindness and helpfulness, and that leads to unification with others, and abstention from all kinds of intoxicants that cause confusion and mindlessness and confusion of the mind, and instead committing yourself to a radiant and clear mindfulness, a real clarity of purpose in your life. So these great ethical principles are natural morality. They come out of the Buddha's vision of life. They are the expression of the Buddha's enlightenment. So we need to train in this. For a Buddha, this is his freedom. He acts always with kindness and generosity and contentment and so on. So he is our model. We are committed to going for refuge to the Buddha, basing ourselves on his behaviour in terms of these precepts. So I think it's very, very obvious the connection you can see between liberation and following these precepts, because this is the description of the enlightened consciousness. I think it's also perhaps an unusual point, maybe a bit counterintuitive for some people, but to become free you need to be committed. The word is samvara, being committed. It's the same word for ordination, committed to a particular path. We tend to think that freedom and liberation means that you're free to do everything and anything. But that can just lead to greater and greater disintegration. There comes a point in your life where you do need to decide. Doubt and indecision, wavering between so many options. Well, if you're not careful, your life passes you by and you've achieved nothing. You've achieved nothing, and there's a feeling of regret that you have not expressed your full powers. You know, when you look at the lives of very creative people, when you look at the lives of great spiritual practitioners, when you look at the lives of people who've done a lot in social and even political life, the best of them, they've really committed themselves to a path. They've really given themselves to that and gone into that deeply. Yes, maybe for a while you need to look around and see what's there, but in the end, you need to make a decision as to what your life is. And I think it's very important as well, the whole area of responsibility and liberation. Buddhist ethics is an ethics of personal responsibility. One of the things that one notices in this day and age, and it's always been around, but perhaps we notice it more because of social media, this really is the time of the culture of complaint. You see so much of it that people love blaming other people for their suffering. It seems to be everywhere. Everywhere you look, it seems that people have got something to complain about and moan about and blame. And of course, it's not to say that people haven't suffered at the hands of others. Of course, we know that happens. There are terrible things that go on in society. But in the end, if you're really going to do something about it, you have to take responsibility for your own mind. You have to be concerned with your conscience. You have to be concerned with your ethics. You have to be concerned with your own ethical sensibility, what you have done and what you have not done, and really take charge of yourself. There's a couple of sonnets that John Milton wrote, regarded as England's greatest revolutionary by Christopher Hill, the Marxist historian. Two sonnets called On the New Forces of Conscience. I think that phrase, the new forces of conscience, is very, very interesting, because I think there are a lot of forces of conscience around, forcing us to think in a particular way, or to take a particular stand. No, we need to develop our own conscience based on our spiritual ideals, based on what the Buddha teaches, develop our own ethical sensibility and really take charge of that if we are going to enter into liberation. It's not to say that on occasion you might not call people out who need to be called out, but you always do that ethically, with care and attention and loving kindness. But our first concern is with our own ethical conduct. If you do that, if you commit to a life like that, you're very, very much on the path of the maturing of the liberation of the heart. The third thing that the Buddha mentions, the third condition that leads to the maturing of the liberation of the heart, is what's known as Dhamma kata. Dhamma kata means talking the Dhamma. He says that you need easy access to being with people where you can talk freely about the Dhamma, about the truth in this sense, and explore it deeply and profoundly, and bring yourself to it. This is what we're trying to encourage in study groups and discussion groups, where you take the Dhamma, it's definitely the Dhamma, the Buddha's teaching, and you really try to understand it with one another. Of course, in the Buddha's time, it was an entirely oral culture. Nothing was written down. So talking the Dhamma was the way you learned. But you take the principles of the Dhamma. You're not just talking about yourself all the time and your own limited experience. You're taking Dhamma principles, the Buddha's views, the Buddha's vision. You're trying to understand them, and you're trying to apply them to your life with one another. This isn't theory. This is itself a spiritual practice. To be with spiritual friends, people who are really living the Dhamma life fully, and to be with them fully and to talk the Dhamma together is a powerfully transforming practice. One of the things you're going to be doing there is really seeing your limited, constricting views and attitudes, your habitual views and attitudes that keep you unfree. And you're going to be opening up to perspectives and visions that open up the path of liberation to you. You're going to be moving away from wrong view to right view to developing perfect vision. That's a big, big subject in itself. But it's so important to understand that the Buddha's teaching, formulated into words and ideas, describes the liberating vision. Sometimes it can be hard to understand how that happens, and sometimes our most cherished limiting views might be strongly challenged. But it's very, very important to have this kind of study going on to be clear on the Buddha's doctrine. Like I say, this is a very big subject, and I don't really have time to explore it now. But perhaps one way we can get a feeling from it is just the importance of ideas. Ideas are very, very powerful if they're communicated with real feeling and real experience. And you see this in India, you see this with Dr. Ambedkar, the power of his speeches to open up completely new ways of thinking and seeing the world, to criticise the graded system of inequality that the caste system was, and to open up a pathway to freedom, One of his early slogans was educate, agitate, organise. You educate with new living ideas that have the taste of freedom. Well, we're the same. We need to re-educate ourselves continually with the ideas that come out of the Buddha. The agitation is the shaking up of our consciousness in relation to those ideas, and the organisation is the complete reorganisation of our consciousness, the transformation of our consciousness in relation to those new ideas. So this is what should be going on in a really good study group, in a really good discussion group between spiritual friends. The Buddha goes further. He then says, well, the next condition is the putting forth of energy in the sense of virya, the energy to develop skillful states, the energy to remove unskillful states. What he's actually talking about is the practice of meditation, both on and off the cushion. He's talking about the generation of the stream of skillful and creative states of consciousness. And in meditation that will become more and more concentrated. This starts opening up the whole area of dhyana. And if you've had some experience of meditation, if you've had even just a little sort of sense of deeper meditation, you'll know how liberating that can feel. Whatever's going on for you physically, you might have physical difficulties, whatever is going on in your life, sometimes if you meditate well, you get concentrated in the mindfulness of breathing, or you feel that expansion in the Padmavajra, you have a sense of freedom, an extraordinary freedom like no other. And of course, you start to notice the disparity when you've had that little taste of the freedom of meditation, the disparity between that and unskilled states of mind. You notice how constricted hatred is, how your heart feels so tight when there's ill will in it, although how colourful a craving is, when you're really looking forward to that wonderful thing that you're going to get, whatever it is, actually it doesn't feel free. You're sort of being driven and sort of sent down tracks to get that thing. Ambition is another one. You might notice your powerful egotistical ambition in life, and even though it can feel very, very powerful, actually it's limiting and restricting. So it's very important that we develop skillful, expansive states of consciousness, and we have that taste of freedom in meditation, in dhyana. And of course, it will come and it will go. It will come and it will go. But if we keep making the effort, we'll notice those expansive moments of consciousness in all kinds of situations, not just when we're meditating. So that's the fourth condition that leads to the maturing of the heart's liberation. And then the fifth, the final thing that the Buddha mentions is insight, is prajna, is wisdom. This is so important. This is going to make the liberation of the heart permanent. The Buddha says, it's very, very simple the way he puts it. It goes on. This wisdom is the direct seeing that sees the rise and fall, the coming into existence, the passing out of existence. It's the vision of the impermanence of all things. Dr. Ambedkar talks about the Buddha's wisdom in terms of seeing the mystery of impermanence. Very, very interesting expression, the profound mystery of impermanence. I think that's quite an insight of Dr. Ambedkar's, actually. And we need to contemplate this. We need to contemplate how things arise and pass. And they're always arising and passing. Arising and passing are always present. When we say passing, when the Buddha says passing, it doesn't mean that the ultimate nature of things is nothingness. That's nihilism. Arising and passing are happening all the time. When you look closely at life, you can see it particularly in this gorgeous autumn that we're enjoying. You're seeing those leaves falling, And you think, oh, well, that's the end. But of course, it's not the end. It's just a change. They're turning into mud on the ground before you. I see this up in our wood at the end of the path, up in the nature reserve, going into the deepest part of that. And this whole scene is all arising and passing. You can see why, in the Mahayana and the Heart Sutra, they talk about form is emptiness, emptiness is form. Form does not differ from emptiness. Emptiness does not differ from form. There's no need, there's no way that you can hold on and define yourself as separate from the scene. You are part of the arising and ceasing, part of the form and the emptiness. There's nowhere to settle and stay and fix yourself. So when you really, not just see this, when you taste this, when you have the direct experience of this, your liberation is guaranteed. There is no falling back from the continual expansion and opening of the liberation of the heart. So these are the 5 conditions that lead to the liberation of us, the liberation of consciousness. And as I say, the Buddha insists it all comes from Kalyana Mitrata. It comes because we are in touch with the lineage going back to the Buddha. We are in touch with immediate spiritual friends who are connected with the lineage of the Buddhist tradition. That's where it all comes from. We don't make this stuff up. We resonate with it because of something in us. There's that potential for Buddhahood, that potential for complete liberation. But we're resonating, thankfully, with something that is coming to us from outside. So these are the 5 conditions that lead to the liberation of the heart. And I hope that in the groups you'll have a good look at these 5. Kalyana Mitrata, spiritual friendship, commitment to a path of ethics, talking the Dhamma, energy in meditation, and wisdom itself. And see, how do they lead to the liberation of the heart? We're in a time where it's hard to feel free. It's hard to feel liberated with this virus that's present and all the different ways in which things have been closed down. It's such a difficult time for so many people. We're very fortunate living here. Just the size of our community, 14 of us, 16 of us at the moment, I can't quite remember, in a large space, a wonderful space in the countryside. So we're very conscious that we're very grateful to the conditions that we have, and we're also very grateful to be in touch with people like yourselves out there. Some of you I know doing really good work and finding things, very, very difficult in many ways. But liberation has nothing to do with where we are in space and time. We're liberated anywhere, whatever's going on outside. Liberation is for every place, and in a sense, for no place, and for any time and no time. And I think it's important that we just hear about an extraordinary liberation, the Achintya Vimoksha, the inconceivable liberation that Vimalakirti describes in the Vimalakirti Nidesha, which in many ways is the heart of that whole sutra. So just listen to the Bodhisattva's inconceivable liberation. Let's not put any limit on our consciousness, any limit on our heart, wherever we are in terms of space and time. Just listen how the Bodhisattva practices the inconceivable liberation. The Bodhisattva who lives in the inconceivable liberation can put the king of mountains, Sumeru, which is so high, so great, so noble and so vast, into a mustard seed. He can perform this feat without enlarging the mustard seed and without shrinking Mount Sumeru. And the deities of the assembly of the 4 Maharajas and the 33 heavens do not even know where they are. Furthermore, Reverend Shariputra, the Bodhisattva who lives in the inconceivable liberation, can pour into a single pore of his skin all the waters of the four great oceans without injuring the water animals such as fish, tortoises, crocodiles, frogs, and other creatures, and without the Nagas, Yakshas, Gandharvas, and Asuras even being aware of where they are. And the whole operation is visible without any injury or disturbance to any of those living beings. Such a bodhisattva can pick up with his right hand this billion-world galactic universe as if it were a potter's wheel, and spinning it round, throw it beyond universes as numerous as the sands of the Ganges, without the living beings therein knowing their motion or its origin, and he can catch it and put it back in its place without the living beings suspecting their coming and going, and yet the whole operation is visible. He goes on to talk about how the bodhisattva living in the inconceivable liberation can make some people's spiritual development seem to last for eons. We know how that feels. Perhaps a bodhisattva is putting us through a training that is lasting for a long time, but for others he can make it seem like an instant, in a moment. He goes on and on in this direction. He can inhale all the hurricanes of the cosmic wind atmospheres of the 10 directions into his mouth without harming his own body and without letting the forests and the grasses of the Buddha fields be flattened. He can take all the masses of fire of all the supernovas that ultimately consume all the universes of all the Buddha fields into his stomach without interfering with their functions, and so on and so forth. He just goes on and on in this way, talking about the Bodhisattva's inconceivable liberation. It's very interesting, the response to that by Mahakassapa. In fact, Vimalakirti says, that I haven't exhausted even a fraction of this inconceivable liberation that the Bodhisattva lives in. In other words, the great Bodhisattva, the advanced Bodhisattva, one who has really liberated their heart. There is no restriction on him or her whatsoever. There is complete freedom of consciousness. You could put them in a cell for the rest of their life and they would not feel any restriction. That's the kind of being that we're trying to become. And Mahakassapa, one of the great arahants, listening to this, he says a very, very interesting thing. He says, well, this is amazing for the bodhisattvas to listen to this. But for us, for people like us, upon hearing this teaching, this incredible teaching of the Dharma, we should utter a cry of regret that would shake this billion-world galactic universe. A cry of regret of that magnitude, because we know that we can't attain it. It's so far from us. Interestingly enough, when he said what he said, numerous gods and goddesses developed the bodhicitta. I think it's a very significant passage in the Vimalakirti Nidesha. I can really identify with Mahakassapa's cry, that cry of regret and longing at feeling so far away from the liberation of the Bodhisattva. But that cry of longing is actually the beginning of such liberation. Sometimes we need to feel how restricted we really are in order to really step onto the path of liberation, the path of liberation that Vimalakirti gives us, that the Buddha gives us. So reflect on that in your groups, both the vision of liberation, but perhaps also notice how far you have to go before you realise that inconceivable liberation. Thank you for listening.